clay called Stony White. It's a different kind of clay than what most of you guys will be using. But this is just what I have for today, so I'm gonna use this. To prep my clay, I wedged it out and I made sure that there's no air bubbles in it. Because if I run into an air bubble on the wheel, it's gonna be very difficult to throw with, okay? So I'm just gonna prep my clay. Right now I'm putting it into a ball so we can throw it. And I'm taking all of these little creases here and sealing them up so that they don't create an air pocket. Okay, so my clay is ready. And I am going to take my sponge and get a little bit wet. And I like to get the surface of my bat just a little wet so it kind of sticks the clay on there. All right, take that, and you throw it on center. And so now I'm gonna start the 6-step process to wheel throwing, which I broke in wheel throwing down, and right now we're gonna start centering, okay? So to center your clay, if you're right-handed, you're gonna start centering on this side. If you're left-handed, you'll center on this side, and you'll make your wheel go a different direction. So something to think about there. But what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna take my clay, I'm at my sponge, and I'm gonna get it really wet. And I'm gonna seal my clay down to my bat, so the edges of the clay are sitting like this onto that surface. That just helps it to not fly off. So I'm gonna get it really wet. I'm gonna stick my elbow right into my hip socket right there, so it's supported really well. And I'm gonna take this portion of my hand and I'm gonna put it up against that clay. I like to rotate my thumb in towards the middle just a little bit to kind of help get this edge. And then on this hand, I'm gonna keep my sponge in my hand and make sure it has a full amount of water. And I'm gonna use the edge of my hand to go over top of the clay, like that, okay? And all of my hands and my elbows are in spots where they're supported. If my elbow is not in a supported spot, it'll be really hard to put any pressure against this clay because I don't have any support with it. So I'm gonna put it right there, add some water, have my thumb over center, and I'm gonna apply pressure from both sides. Get some more water. Okay. The harder I press on the top, the lower the clay goes, right? The harder I press on the side, the higher the clay goes. So I want to make sure I have an even amount of clay. And I don't want my clay any higher than this, because the next step, it gets kind of difficult if it is too high. And this is also a method, the rise and fall of the clay and the centering process. It's also a method to wedge your clay out and make sure there's no air bubbles. So if you're not very confident that you wedged out all those air bubbles, you can do this a couple times, and it brings all the bubbles up to the surface. Okay, so there's that. I'm actually gonna go down a little further. There we go. Okay, so now my clay's centered. It doesn't wobble. It's got a nice flat surface for me to do the next process. My edges are good and it totally touches the bat. Okay, that's all the things I'm gonna look for in centering. Okay, so that's the end of step 1. So step 2 is opening your clay. This is where you create how wide you want your pot to be on the inside for the base. If you want a wide pot in the middle, right, like a vase that kind of comes up and then goes out, you still want to think about how wide the base of that vase is. Okay, so I'm going to open this up as wide as my 4 fingers. So I'm going to take my sponge, get it really wet. I'm going to put my sponge underneath my middle finger. I'm going to take both my hands and lay them on the side of the clay, and then put my thumbs over the center of the clay. Right? And these fingers are sitting really relaxed. I'm not putting any pressure on the outside. Once I feel I have found the center of the clay, I'm going to slowly start digging my nails down into that clay. I'm going to squeeze some water in there. You don't want to go down too far. Okay, so now that I've gone down a little bit, I'm going to measure out the thickness on the bottom. You want to make sure your thickness is about 1/2 inch to 3/4 of an inch. And I like to use my knuckle as a measurement. Okay, so that's about 3/4 of an inch. You can go 1/2 inch to 3/4. So I'm going to leave that thickness on the bottom. If you go too far down, or if you go far enough that you fill the bat, you've just created a donut, and you don't want a donut. You want a pot that has a bottom to it. Okay, so now I'm going to go back into that shape, and now I'm going to open up the bottom. So I'm going to just take my hands and go straight to my knees. Notice I'm not pinching, bringing my thumbs to my fingers, because what that does, that pinches the clay and it breaks it off. I'm just going to take my whole hand and move it to the outside of the clay. And this is where you want to open it only as far as your 4 fingers. Okay, that's about that height. I kept my thumbs as level as I could, so now my bottom is kind of flat. There's places where my nails kind of grooved into it, so we'll flatten that out. But that's about 4 fingers wide, and I just brought my fingers straight, my whole hand straight to my knees. Okay. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to compress that bottom. I'm going to get all this slip off of my hands and my sponge, and I'm going to clean out that water and take a look at what it looks like. So now what I need to do is I need to compress this clay so that as I'm throwing, there's going to be a lot of water onto the inside of the pot. And what I want to do is I want to be able to compress this clay so that the water doesn't seep into it and break it down. So I'm going to take my thumb, kind of push that in, and that's one way to compress your clay. Smooth it out. But another way you can do it, and honestly my favorite way, is to use the wooden rib. I like to take this 90-degree angle and to put it against the inside of the pot. And what that does is it flattens out the bottom as well as the sides. So now I have a really nice and crisp corner. Okay. And this is the end of step 2.